In this talk, I will discuss how can we read the future consequences of the present crisis of care that we have witnessed both prior and are continuing to face and witness in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic. This I will explore from the perspective of pirate care, a project that Valeria Graziano, Marcel Mars, and I have convened 4 or 5 years ago. I will introduce the practices of pirate care, discuss how community care organizing in the pandemic has filled the gap of care, which is structural in character, yet failed to politicize and contest the larger realignments in the provision of care, driven by forces of private provision, venture capital, and intellectual property. Furthermore, I will discuss the technopolitical implications of our project. These reflections are in many respects dark and discouraging, but provide indications of how we can conceive of real utopias of care, where the care in the community and the public care provision are built in a just and mutually sustaining way. First, a couple of canonical definitions of care or practices of care. John Tronto and Bernice Fisher's definition is as follows. In the most general sense, care is a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we may live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. And this is more of a comment by David Graeber on what care from a class perspective might mean. If you think about it, is this not what life is basically about? Human beings are projects of mutual creation. Most of the work we do is on each other. The working classes just do a disproportionate share. They are the caring classes and always have been. Throughout our lives, we depend on the support of our families, friends, strangers, and institutions to sustain ourselves and to sustain the world in which we and the future generations have to live. That interdependency of humans and non-human nature in social and ecological reproduction defines the relations of care. And the effort to sustain those relations defines the labor of care. Pirate care was convened with the objective to map and connect collective practices that are emerging in response to the neoliberal crisis of care. A convergence of processes that include austerity, replacement of universal welfare with means testing and workfare, the conservative attack on reproductive rights, and the criminalization of migration, all processes that have denied that vital support to the many. Against this background of financialized, let me go back. Against this background of financialized global capitalism, over the last decade and a half, we have witnessed a growing wave of mobilizations around care, addressing a number of fundamental needs. For instance, the Docs Not Cops campaign in the UK, with doctors and medical staff refusing to carry out document checks on migrant patients. The growing resistance to homelessness via the reappropriation of houses left empty by speculators, as in the case of La Paz in Spain. The defiance to legislation making homelessness illegal, such as in the case of Hungary's ban on rough sleeping that was enacted in October of 2018. Or the civilian search and rescue naval missions, such as those operated by Sea-Watch, that defy the criminalization of NGOs active to save lives of those crossing the Mediterranean. All these practices do not only push back against the repression of vulnerable people, but also against quote-unquote institutionalized negligence, a notion coined by Fred Moulton and Stefano Harvey, to denote failures of care systems. To give you an example of such institutionalized negligence that you all will be familiar with, in Greece, a growing number of grassroots clinics was set up by the solidarity movements in the last decade, responding to the draconian cuts to public services. And they did so by providing medical attentions to those without private insurance, including migrants. In Italy, precarious parents without recourse to public childcare are organizing their own pirate kindergartens. Here you can see the photo of Soprasotto Kindergarten in Milan. In Spain, the feminists around the collective feminist collective Ginepunk have developed a toolkit for gynecological self-diagnosis to allow all those excluded from reproductive health services, such as trans women, drug users, or sex workers, to perform basic checks on their own bodies. Meanwhile, the collective Women on Waves has been providing safe contraceptive and abortion options to women in countries where these are not available, at times using boats harbored in international waters, like veritable care pirates. These days, they even resort to drones to fly in medical pregnancy termination into countries where that is illegal. And of course, as in the case of our own work, Marcel and mine, liberate knowledge where access is denied to public libraries, which is the case of shadow libraries. Crucially, these all practices share a willingness to openly disobey laws and executive orders whenever these stand in the way of safety and solidarity, and politicize that disobedience to contest the status quo. That disobedience and that politicization is what defines them, in our view, as pirate care. Our project specifically is aimed to activate collective learning processes from the knowledge generated in and through these practices. In this, we have been inspired by the phenomenon of #syllabi, that is crowdsourced online syllabi created by social justice movements in response to situations of intense antagonisms, such as Ferguson's syllabus that was created in response to the police killing of Michael Brown in 2014, gaming and feminism syllables created in response to the Gamergate harassment campaign against the feminist computer game writers, or Standing Rock syllables created in response to the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota nations standoff against the Dakota Access Pipeline in the US. We have written about this phenomenon in our own article, Learning from #syllabus. Building on that reflection, we have set out to develop a radical pedagogy, that would help social justice initiatives write online syllabi of their own. The first round of topics for the Pirate Care syllabus was written in November of 2019 during a writing retreat organized by Drugo More in Rijeka and launched on March 8th of 2020 for the opening of Bread, Wine, Cars, Security and Peace exhibition at Kunsthalle Wien. The syllabus and expanding work in progress currently includes topics on criminalization of solidarity, sea rescue and care, common in care work and childcare, housing struggles, psychological autonomy in insurrectionist contexts, a peer-to-peer social technology of healthcare devised by Cassie Thornton and called Hologram, community safety from racialized policing, transfeminist hacking, hormone toxicity and bodily sovereignty, gender equality in tech milieus, and politicizing digital piracy. To pursue this process of radical pedagogy, we have developed an experimental publishing framework titled Sandpoints that would enable the syllabi as well as the collections of texts that accompany them to be collectively created, easily preserved, and maintained independently from large digital platforms. Currently, ubiquitous network technologies are precipitating an all-sided deskilling of users, both in workplace, in free time, and in social reproduction. While the mass industrial workforce in the 20th century could acquire a collective understanding of the shop floor machinery and understanding of how to lay it still, with network systems, that is all the more harder, as can be seen in the struggles of platform workers to coordinate, unionize, and strike. Thus, in our technological development, our own technological development, we want to create cloud-independent technologies that foster popular technical pedagogy at various skill levels, empowering members of collectives to take care of the collective knowledge production and collective memory processes. In our view, editors, translators, librarians, more or less technologically skilled, are at the center of our collective learning up and upskilling to stand up against the loss of autonomy to techno-capitalist forces. Going back to the Pirate Care syllabus, initially we were planning to organize a collective learning process from that collectively written syllabus, a summer camp in the summer of 2020. However, given the pandemic, that was never meant to be. Just a couple of days after we launched the syllabus, as the COVID-19 pandemic was breaking out across Europe, we have rolled over our work of the syllabus into a collective note-taking effort to document organizing of mutual aid, solidarity, and care in response to the crisis. This effort we have titled Flatten the Curve, Grow the Care. What are we learning from the COVID-19? With the participation of a broader Pirate Care community, we have collected and created around 15 notes, instructions, and how-tos that were coming from and were being used by mutual aid organizers in Italy, Croatia, the UK, and elsewhere across the world. The notes included information on how to assist people in home isolation or how to organize solidarity kitchens, on reproductive rights, home violence, and childcare in the quarantine, on mutual aid models for the jobless, for instance, sex workers, write-ups on the implications of the pandemic on disability, environmentalism, and technology. They were immediately translated into English, Italian, German, and Spanish, and used widely. However, a couple of months into the pandemic, there was no shortage of resources, many far superior to ours. Documenting practices was also not the purpose of our endeavor, so we have gone back to our work with the Pirate Care practitioners. Still, throughout the pandemic, we have continued following the care organizing amidst the crisis and reflecting on its trajectory. The COVID-19 pandemic has made many of the pre-existing contradictions of social and ecological reproduction under financialized global capitalism more apparent. Let's quickly look at what those are. First, caring is not intrinsically nice. Care work always involves power relations and processes of discipline, exclusion, and harm. It is a necessary and skilled form of labor that is shouldered by workers, mostly unwaged women and migrants, who themselves receive the least amount of care while serving those who take care labor for granted. Reciprocity and solidarity are not implied in care provision. Second, the famous graph in the title, this one here, Flatten the Curve, Grow the Care, standing for higher or lower rates of contagion and an unspecified healthcare capacity, represented as a straight line that the ideal pandemic curve should not breach. That was the famous graph at the beginning of the pandemic. However, that straight line in the graph was never actually a straight line nor a single line. It actually depicted the decline of society's capacity for care under the relentless neoliberalization and criminalization. So it's not a horizontal line by any means. And it depicts the uneven distribution of healthcare capacity, which was until the pandemic visible only on one side of the class, gender, and race divide, and suddenly detonated as a generalized social threat in the pandemic. Now that we know much more about the social etiology of the coronavirus, it is clear that those who were on the front line and on whom societies depended for the provision of care and reproductive labor, those who had no choice but to go to work and who were hardest hit by the epidemic threat, have remained and will continue to remain the more vulnerable on their side of the class, gender, and race divide. And here you can see in the background the graph indicating who were people in the front line. And you can see that in the US, people of color were far more represented in that demographic than any other part of the demographic. And sure enough, that part of the demographic was hardest hit. As said earlier, care labor is mostly shouldered by women and migrants, people of color, in many societies of the global north. And then this functions in the global division of labor in various ways, which we can maybe go into later in questions. Okay, here we go. No, this is perhaps care. Okay. Let me provide two examples of disobedient care organizing of care workers in the pandemic that highlight and address those asymmetries. First example is Zagreb. It is a self-organized initiative of East European live-in care workers in Austria that was founded in 2020 to protect caregivers from exploitation and abuse. The initiative provides counseling, crisis support, and political advocacy for caregivers who are nominally in Austria self-employed, but in reality are recruited and dependent on employment agencies, making them ineligible for trade union representation, minimum wage agreements, pay vacation, or sick leave. Zagreb argues that if caregivers were entitled to full protection under labor law, the entire system of elderly care would no longer be financially viable in Austria, and that this makes agencies, the state, and the bulk of Austrian society complicit in their exploitation. Amid the pandemic, the initiative has built a Facebook community of over 10,000 carers and organized protests demanding proper employment status and protection for care workers. Sezonieri, this is the second example, is an activist-led campaign for the rights of agricultural workers in Austria, which supports the labor struggles of migrant seasonal workers in collaboration with the trade union ProG. Austria, like most European countries, has put in place processes that illegalize migration, and this in turn has led to shortages of exploitable labor. During the pandemic, Austria thus had to organize a special fly-in visa regime for workers from East European countries so that they can come and pick asparagus and salad. These workers were provided with no epidemiologically safe accommodation nor medical care. To counter this, Sezonieri has been working with migrant seasonal workers to prevent exploitation, improve working conditions, and help enforce their rights. In their outreach activities, activists go on to farms to meet the workers, facing the threat of trespassing on private land and private property. In the midst of the pandemic, however, Sezonieri have put a list of demands onto the political agenda for higher wages, better sanitary conditions, and compensation for the increased health risks incurred by migrant agricultural workers, as well as for the abolition of nativist and anti-migrant discourses, the decriminalization of migration, and the creation of a more just system of food production. The immediate responses and long-term, just to ask you, can you follow me? Am I going too quick, too incomprehensible? How's that?
Super.
Super. Okay, great. The immediate responses and long-term consequences of the pandemic were hard to read at its beginning. The unprecedented suspension of routine activities and the sudden explosion of the need for care made us consider that the illegibility of the situation could not be well comprehended by well-worn theoretical framings, but that the radical uncertainty of the situation required us to stay close to the practices that responded to the needs as they emerged. However, as the pandemic wore on, it was hard not to see how the responses and consequences started to consolidate. Despite the wealth of grassroots solidarity initiatives and some unprecedented relief measures taken at the governmental level in various countries, which have included the temporary renationalization of hospitals and the distribution of basic income to citizens most affected by the pandemic, strong political mobilizations aimed at the failures of care systems, either locally or internationally, have remained largely subdued. There were protests, but they faded in comparison to the anti-lockdown protests. In contrast to reactions in other historical moments of major crisis, there seems to have been serious difficulty in finding ways of organizing that are effective political responses to the situation. For instance, implementing the kinds of welfare reform that would be necessary at a relevant scale to meet people's needs in such a crisis would have implied inevitably a radical change to current taxation regimes or radical change to elderly care. As nothing much has changed since the pandemic, many exasperated caregivers have simply left the care system. Caring for people's lives is increasingly being organized through regimes of property and deregulated labor market, and these developments have only accelerated during the pandemic. Here I want to outline three trends within the world of big capital that are shaping the practices through which care provision is organized. So first is an acceleration in the deregulated and digitally controlled, that is, platform division of labor. The accelerated digitization of all aspects of life in the pandemic has led to a significant transformation of labor conditions. Those who could work in the safety of their homes have come to depend on digital platforms for their work, i.e. Zoom, for delivery of groceries and medicines, as well as for contact with their friends and families. Their needs were being catered to by a mushrooming army of low-wage care workers, warehouse pickers, and couriers who have had to continue moving along the logistical vectors. The pandemic lockdown thus had led to a precipitous increase in the rate at which both telework and needs provision work are being transformed into forms of what Ursula House has called, quote unquote, logged labor, coordinated, quantified, and measured through the apps and platforms. Similar processes have engulfed education, culture, and recreation. Big tech corporations have readily embraced their central position in the coordination of this new pandemic life. Amazon, Deliveroo, and an endless roster of other delivery services have expanded to meet this exploding demand, unflinchingly piling pressure on their staff to work at a breakneck pace. In a parallel process, the kinds of tech companies that primarily command technology and data rather than labor, were aiming for an increase in public esteem. Google and Apple could thus claim a role of benevolent public health advocates, creating a privacy-preserving contact tracing protocol and regularly releasing community mobility reports to monitor the effects of lockdown measures. Meanwhile, Zoom, WhatsApp, and other communication services were determining our capacity to work, socialize, and organize. Differences between those companies aside, this sudden dependence on private digital platforms, dubbed by Naomi Klein as the Screen New Deal, has created windfall profits for the techno-capitalist oligarchy. The financial markets, awash with money that had nowhere to be invested amid the largest global economic contraction since the World War II, have also secured fantastic increases in the wealth of these technological corporations. Second trend, marketization of healthcare provision. Healthcare systems in many countries had already been deliberately disaggregated. High-value treatments had been privatized, and private clinics had been allowed to extract high returns, while public healthcare systems were tasked with basic healthcare provision and disease prevention, areas that were consistently underfunded and under-resourced. With governments ignoring the warnings of scientists that an epidemic of this kind was only a matter of time, the capacity to produce medical supplies and conduct epidemiological responses in the face of any such emergency had been severely cut over the last decade, say. Thus, governments found themselves dependent on the private sector for the speedy delivery of protection equipment, test and trace procedures, and the vaccines. This retreat from the public provision is widespread, but it is arguably best evidenced in the field of high-tech medicines, where the domination of big pharma, together with the slow but ongoing process of divestment from public research and development, has led to reduced capacity for the production of medicines that address public health concerns. The unprecedented funding they received, these private big pharma companies, and the advance orders for their vaccines placed prior to their finalization socialized the risk of developing these new treatments, but the resulting market valuations, profits, and patents have all remained private. The net effect of this market-dependent approach was that the less affluent part of the world was left to its own devices. It had no access to vaccines, and at least not in time. The novel approach to quick delivery vaccines championed by BioNTech and Moderna is based on messenger RNA, which is also projected to be essential for custom treatments for cancer and heart diseases. This branch of medical research is dominated by private companies and closed patents. Future high-value precision medicines are thus likely to remain in private ownership, meaning that in the future, this model of development is likely to siphon off even more resources from public healthcare systems, making them even less capable of responding to future public healthcare crises, and making the availability of treatments even more highly uneven. Even more highly uneven. Last trend that I want to discuss is assetization of provision systems. What these previous two processes share is that they are part of accelerated conversion of care provision into assets. That is a specific kind of private property that focuses on profits from rising values of financial assets. This is part of the wider trend toward financialization of ever larger categories of provision of goods and services, and it creates the basis for financial capital to exert control over the future of development of large swaths of social systems without necessarily holding direct ownership or responsibility for them. Essential care provisions such as health, assistance for the elderly, housing, education, and so on are being increasingly assetized, transformed into financial instruments, while at the same time, the pensions, health insurance, and savings of many ordinary people have come to depend on the income generated by these same processes of financialization and assetization. Assetization is thus progressively locking ever larger number of people into a trend in social development that will create even more radically segregated societies while expropriating us from our very capacity to shape the future, because assets, financial instruments are in a way control over the returns in the future. In the absence of other means to mobilize around the future of care provision, it is urgent that laws that support imperial processes of assetization and the intensification of an unequal division of labor are disobeyed and politicized. The wave of community-driven organizing we witnessed with the onset of the pandemic was geared towards filling the gaps created by insufficient capacity, bureaucratic negligence, and deliberate exclusion across the institutional landscape of care provision. Such organizing is, however, situated and localized, while the mechanisms driving the development of contemporary institutional landscape of care provision are structural and global. Assetization creates self-reinforcing mechanisms that seriously limit the future possibilities for institutional transformation, and they preempt any change of direction toward most socialized and responsive care provision. In the absence of other means to mobilize around the future of care provision, it is urgent that laws that support imperial processes of assetization and the intensification of an equal division of labor are disobeyed and politicized. So that's what follows from my discussion previously. To conclude, in the long run, the interdependence has to become the central theme in organizing social and economic institutions. We depend on the care work of others, and they have to receive enough care in return. Our well-being depends centrally on teachers, nurses, carers, cleaners, bus drivers, and farm pickers, as well as on unpaid care workers who are mostly friends, family, and stranger, usually women, wives, daughters, mothers. The health of human societies depends on the health of wild animals and their ecosystems. The populations of wild animals have been collapsing over the last 50 years. Around 66% of all animal wildlife populations have collapsed. Economy is embedded in and dependent on the society, and the society is embedded and dependent on the planetary ecosystems. Therefore, human well-being fundamentally depends on on intactness or conservation of ecosystems, and giving space to animals and plants to be able to expand and reclaim some of the lost ecosystems. The public provision of care and the communal provision of care thus have to become integrated. The care has to be deinstitutionalized, brought down into the territory of the everyday, and provided in a cooperative division of labor, providing holistic support for the vulnerable and support for those who provide care. Such commoning of the care systems has been successfully attempted, for instance, in the Trieste model of mental health care, and such models have to be expanded and transported elsewhere. Irrespective of their position in the division of labor, no matter whether unwaged, invisibilized, or precarious, all members of society should be entitled to basic security of food, housing, healthcare, and education. Universal basic services have to be universal to everyone, particularly those who provide the services. particularly in context of an aging population. These services will become increasingly technologized, and there should be a collective understanding and development of these technological systems. The long-term provision for those social needs should be untied from the mechanisms of financialization, assetization, and the extraction of value. Only then will we see the expansion and not only optimization of capacity that has led to the warehousing of the elderly in elderly homes and has brought such a huge death toll in the pandemic. We fundamentally need to rethink the deinstitutionalization of care, as said previously. The development of COVID-19 vaccines has ex negativo demonstrated the import of open innovation. The closed patented innovation processes in developing COVID-19 vaccines has resulted in difficulties to produce vaccines at scale. Many vaccine producers struggled to advance quickly enough in their development and would have benefited from sharing discoveries and patents. On the other hand, once the first vaccines were out, vaccine plants that had no license to produce stood idle, while those that did struggled to produce enough of vaccines. This model of technological development, closed-sourced, has resulted in a slow rollout of vaccines with a negative effect on the global population in general. So with this, I conclude sort of like short program for real utopias of care and my presentation, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have around care organizing, larger questions of care provision, interdependence as the fundamental aspect of care, and so on and so forth. Maybe just as a point of interest, we are now slowly wrapping up the work around pirate care and writing a book on it, but our next focus of inquiry is what we call snađi se druže practices of how people cheat, lie, and steal from a position of no power and from a position where systems have failed them. So we are trying to unpack a little bit illegal practices that, from a liberal perspective, are from the liberal perspective, they are usually considered kind of, and they are not condoned, but we think that there are structural systemic reasons that they appear everywhere. Everybody has the stories of people's ingenuity and resilience. And we want to kind of explore that, and we could call this like a prequel to pirate care, insofar as care is an action extended to the other, and snađi se druže is an action of reclaiming the conditions under which one has to exist and survive.
Okay. Study the Balkans very carefully. You need to study the Balkans very carefully if you're doing this snađi se druže model. I think it's
yeah, it's situated in a way in the Balkans and the global south, where systems do not exist or are structured in a way that they cannot be comprehensive, cannot extend provisions to the entire population. And this Friday we are coming to Belgrade, and with Kiosk we are doing our first round of field work mostly with women who are providing live-in care labor, be it in Serbia or in particular in countries of Western Europe. And they obviously have a lot of stories of resilience, but also we are interested in various other things, where people are trying to circumvent bureaucratic barriers, or I don't know, are divorcing so that they could change their formal status and get entitlements so that they could have enough money to get by and things like that. there are many kind of these practices, and we are trying to not to exoticize them, but rather to look at what's structurally specific to them. No, it's very different if you lie, cheat, and steal from a position of power. If you're in as doing that as a position as a politician, or um, a capitalist, an entrepreneur, it's just very different than popular classes doing it, and we want to um, a little bit deconstruct the liberal notions that are usually applied to these kinds of practices.
Great. You know, there is the Solidarity Kitchen working in Belgrade since the pandemic's here.
Yeah, I know of it. Yeah.
You can't see our faces. I was nodding, very impressed. I would actually be very interested to see a comparative study of the global south and global north. So where the capitalist system is forcing this kind of snađice situation, and where it is just a lack of system, or this kind of conglomeration of the capitalist but failed like half systems that we have. That would be also interesting.
Thank you so much for this talk. So I have a feeling, please correct me others, but that we really went into a very dystopic way of thinking about what we can even do in the situation, and how to get Yugo-futurism, this theme that we are dealing with, out of these sort of walls of not being able to organize among ourselves, or really just how do we even organize? What do we do with what we have and what we know, and how do we reach out to each other? So one thing that I wanted to ask, it's also, it has something like with my personal experience, family experience during the pandemic. So you mentioned something about that we need to rethink the institution of elderly care. What did you exactly like? Can you just talk a little bit more, because I was really like it rang something like I felt it, but I never really thought about it, like what so
I mean, specifically for Croatia, the driver of the crisis is the aging population. We have a larger and larger part of the demographic that is old, 65 plus, and while they live longer as well than maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the quality of life is really low for people of 65, for pensioners. Once you retreat from the world of labor, if you are included to start with, you have very little provisions, and that's a huge problem. The quality of life for the elderly. In the pandemic, the problem was obviously that elderly homes were hotspots where the disease was spreading, and many people died, and to a degree that was not avoidable given the etiology of disease. But I think in the future, the care for the elderly has to move to the community instead of institutions. Institutions have to really be reserved for those who need 24/7 care, whereas the rest need to receive care in such a manner that the burden of it doesn't fall on members of the family, women usually, as I said, wives, daughters, sisters, mothers, which is usually the case. So this is where a lot of organizing in the community has to be supported by the institutions, but also institutions have to transform so that they are nested within the community. No, and as I said, there is a well-proven model just close to us in Trieste that was created in late 70s, early 80s in the mental health provision, where Franco Basaglia, a psychiatrist, was appointed chief of the asylum in San Giovanni in Trieste, and he decided to open up the institution and eventually move all the inpatients into the community. He first put together into individual pavilions people who were from the same neighborhood, and then he moved them and the community and the care into the community. And they also did at the time a lot of legal innovation. There is the famous Basaglia law from 79, I believe, that mandates that no mental health clinics of closed types are to be created. And there is a law on social enterprise from 1981 that has given a special status to cooperatives that have more than 30% of their members as members of vulnerable groups. And these vulnerable groups have been changing over time. They receive a special tax status and special status in public procurement. So they are also, in many ways, protected workshops for people who struggle with addiction, with mental health care issues, disability, and so on and so forth. So that's one model that exists close by. There is another model that was developed in a Dutch town of Borzog, where you have teams of 12 healthcare professionals who form a small team located within a neighborhood, and they are able to organize sort of holistic, many-sided care for each individual patient in that neighborhood. And then the interesting aspect of this model is that it can depersonalize care provision insofar as it's not always one carer who cares for one person. That has the effect that it's rather a couple. No, there is attachment, but there is no negative effect that care receivers are frequently dissatisfied with carers because carers cannot provide all the assistance that they need. They did a research in Barcelona and a survey among the elderly, asking them how many hours of care do they need in every day. And the resulting number was something on the scale of 17, whereas the system can provide 1 or 2 hours. No, so that's one interesting aspect of this that system. It also is able to increase the wages of carers, but also once the team grows beyond 12 people, it splits into 2 teams. So you kind of have a network effect of creating small teams across the territory. In Trieste, they don't call this community care; they call this territorialization of care. And I mean, the transition in Trieste was very much the brainchild of the radicalism of 1970s. No, it can't be replicated in that way, and with because it's deeply rooted in criticism of what they call total institutions, which includes not only hospital and mental clinic, but also prison system, et cetera, et cetera. And it's deeply rooted in the idea that every patient has to retain their citizen rights. They cannot be easily relieved of their rights, which also means that they cannot be forcefully kept in the clinic unless the city mayor signs off. So you need a political decision to be able to take somebody's freedom of movement, no? And sometimes that's needed, no? If somebody's in psychotic condition, for their sake, you need to keep them. But there is no restraining and only very limited number of beds. Like the whole Trieste has 30 beds in mental health care. The city of Zagreb has around 1,200. So that's just, and those 1,200 are pretty much a social system, a system of social care provision, not only mental care provision. And then if you move to somewhere else, like, I don't know, Popovača, which is set more in a rural or peri-urban part of Croatia, it is truly for everybody who has no family, is alcoholic, needs support, is suicidal. They all come to a mental clinic to provide social care instead of being provided in community. So, I mean, not to belabor this anymore, but fundamentally, this is the shift that needs to happen also in elderly care. No, and it's rather urgent. No, it's clear that you cannot create as many beds in institutions in elderly homes for as there will be older people. You have to improve their late years, you know, that they have to have a quality of life. And then the first and foremost, care has to be transformed so that it's well provided within the territory of the community.
Thank you. More questions?
How necessary do you think it? I mean, I know of your practice previous, so I understand where the concept comes from. But the way you're calling this pirate care, I mean, it's just a thought that so we are witnessing this epic scale lack of any kind of human value, and among them is of course solidarity and care. So, like, are we with these discursive spreading, networking, connecting these diverse practices that we've been witnessing in this transition to this chaos that we're living now? How do you see it? I mean, do you see it like for you or for your field or in general that it's very important that we connect these things, or that essentially you're just trying to translate this actually very essential and very old concept of solidarity?
Well, specifically with pirate care, we were also initially thinking like, who is this for? No, like the syllabus that we were creating, that knowledge that we were documenting with the practitioners of pirate care, who is this for? And then we thought that it's primarily for people who want to organize, who have some basic understanding of the crisis of care and want to learn from or get inspired by the practices of others. And I guess, yes, in that sense, the purpose of Pirate Care as a project is trying to connect various practitioners and people who might be willing to mobilize in such a way. And then second and more specific aspect of this comes from our work around amateur librarianship and trying to help these movements document their knowledge and do it in a sustainable way. I didn't talk much about the technological aspects of standpoints that we have developed to do BADco syllabus and various other projects in the meanwhile. Some of you who were in Rijeka recently heard that as well, so no need to go into that. But at a larger scale, or if we zoom out, what is the meaning of radical care organizing, disobedient care organizing in the present? We think many forms of provision of care, like women's reproductive or sexual healthcare, to be exact, developed primarily as pirate form of care, and then it became legalized and entered the medical systems properly. And it's still the movements that are transforming this system of care. Not all of the care provisions were created like that. Some were created top down by I don't know, reformists. Some were created to, like Bismarckian welfare state was created to buffer working class organizing of mutual aid and support systems, which would allow much more power to labor in situations of strike and laying still of factories. So there are different routes, but we are interested in how much organizing outside of the institutions can push institutions in a certain direction, can formulate the need and sort of wide knowledge that systems of care provision need to transform. If you've discussed degrowth, for degrowth, care economy is the central focus alongside ecological restoration or stabilization. And without changing how care labor is perceived, how it's valued, how it's organized, how skill and knowledge is understood, it's usually considered, this is unskilled labor, it's just physical labor, it's ugly, nobody wants to do it. And in many aspects, it is hard labor, and it has, emotionally draining aspects, but it's necessary. And then ultimately the societies will need to shift to providing more care for human well-being. And then in the degrowth, it has to do with the fact that degrowing certain parts of the economy might cause a lot of distributive injustices and conflicts. And a way to address them, I don't know, of the one example would be yellow vest protests. That was a distributive conflict over the cost of carbon emissions, and it was inordinately placed on the popular classes who live in the peripheries. So that caused a conflict. So unless there is a huge rethink of how well-being is constructed, I think we are ending in a deeper and deeper crisis. And healthcare, for instance, can be hugely improved with very little money. In a way, preventive healthcare, at least in Croatia, is fully dysfunctional, whereas curative healthcare is the central focus of all the investment. and then it's invested into high precision medicines primarily, which are needed, but we have the highest incidence of deaths from cancer, from colon cancer, and sort of the prospects of cancer patients are really dire. So in the end, you do need a lot of expensive precision medicines, just because people don't go to do gastroscopy, and gastroscopy is really cheap, compared to custom drugs. So these are some thoughts. I don't know, but we think that mobilizing and organizing in the community should create a different understanding of how welfare should transform, and that we are the agents of that. That it's not simply a political process where we have no agency and maximum expectations. We need to struggle, we need to organize, we need to claim. And in that sense, like women's sexual health struggles have been vital, and they still are. Like just recently I read a study by an Israeli researcher, and her conclusion was that gynecology is still dominated by men, and these men, and also elderly women who are gynecologists, focus on reproductive aspect and not on the sexual aspect of women's health. No, and that there is still struggle to be fought, and this needs to be fought by some organizing, both from the system and from outside of the system. And it's best when the two can meet, like Docs Not Cops, where people in hospitals refuse to carry out ID checks and charge in the NHS, which is free, anyone procedure. That's I think already capacity to change the direction, or at least to try to change the direction of care provision.
Maybe I have one last question, I don't know. But I was wondering, because we are now dealing with the concept of Yugo-futurism, so very specifically related to this regional geopolitical space. So I was wondering, you were somehow mapping different practices of this parallel organizing, disobedient caretaking, which was somehow mostly distributed not here nearby, but mostly in, I don't know, Spain and other places around. So I was wondering, what is this relation to this geopolitical space and disobedience in this sense of caretaking? Do we have some kind of practices, or this parallel organizing is somehow not been able to somehow to have this moment and to organize themselves? Why is this? Or do we have to just look through the history and through the regional space and look for different practices?
Yeah, I think things are specific. Each of these practices that we look at is largely specific to a context. For instance, and that's the least developed aspect of the pirate care syllabus, the topic of community organizing against racialized policing. It's about a group of community activists, indigenous community activists in Thunder Bay in Canada, who patrol in the evening to prevent that gangs that converge on Thunder Bay, which is a hub for very smaller indigenous communities. So all drug trafficking goes through there and gangs converge. That these gangs don't kill indigenous people, and then also police is frequently violent. So they are trying to so it's very specific. No, it just happens there. Or maybe in some other places in Canada where indigenous and settler communities interface. But specifically to our region, I mean, what's happening in the Balkans route is essential for the survival of the many. Obviously, there is no system to be had there. And this will perpetuate and continue to exist, and it's important to organize. Another aspect which I think is central, at least looking from it's the division of labor in former Yugoslav space, which replicates in a way the division of labor in socialist Yugoslavia, and that's Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina are labor exporting, and Slovenia and Croatia are labor importing parts of the region. This causes a lot of disruption in a care capacity of the labor exporting countries, but Croatia in general is also labor exporting is viewed from the perspective of European Union. So that care gap, we have an aging population and less working age people who work in care, who have mostly gone to Germany and other places where that sort of labor is much better paid. These are kind of common conditions, and they are, I think, site of organizing, site of struggle. Thirdly, I think there's in our society huge expectation of public care provision. I know that is very different between Slovenia and, I don't know, Serbia. Or, I mean, somewhere people expect more from the public, say, healthcare system, and somewhere people don't expect almost anything. No, it's only if you can't do otherwise you go to the public health system. But this is already a ground on which to reclaim, I think, that these systems need to be public, that primary healthcare provision needs to be essential, that preventive care is essential. So there is kind of politics to be had there, I believe. Again, things are specific. I can't really analyze them. I frequently comment from knowing what's happening in Croatia, no, but I assume some things are similar elsewhere. What else? Yeah, housing, I think, at least in Croatia, is a huge issue. It's tourism driven largely, but also migration driven. So that's an aspect. Yeah, migration. Speaking of migration, because of the aging population, the lack of labor, there is more and more of migration, economic migration, organized from top down, and it's up to, in a way, civil society to unpack if this is going to be a kefala-like system, as in the countries of the Gulf, where you have like two-tier of rights and people with citizenship and people with no citizenship who work almost in slavery-like conditions. So this is also another struggle to be had. I don't know. That's what first comes to mind. I think Katya has her hand up from what I can see.
Yes. Should I go?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I was asking myself about how do you, because we were discussing this a little bit in the previous presentation as well, but how do you see the role of the state in this kind of self-organized community practices of care? If you see the state as having any role at all in maybe securing that they remain sustainable also for the people, for the carers themselves, or in their organization or funding or anything like that? Because I was thinking about, you know, how for instance, with the issue of the institutionalization of elderly care or mental health care, what often then happens, and I think this is the case in Slovenia in mental health care, that then users are left to their own devices. Basically, you have very few psychiatric hospitals, and unless you have a very so if it's a very severe case of suicidal tendencies or psychotic breakdown, you are brought into the hospital or bring yourself to the hospital. And then anything other than that, it's basically you're left to yourself to pay for therapy or anything else. And that means that very few people can afford it and very few people actually then make use of the services. So I think that's an example of a strong case for another kind of organizing of these provisions, but also my question is how not to then, just how to prevent that they then become the burden of simply the community, which happens, I think, in elderly care a lot. That then, well, you mentioned it yourself, that then female members of the family, or migrant labor, usually feminized, is tasked with that without pay or with meager pay and so on. So I don't know. I suppose the role of the state or organization of this kind of practices would be my question. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess speaking for Valeria, Marcel, and myself, we see an existing terrain of struggle, no, and state is essential element of in that terrain. It cannot be care cannot be provided at the scale and the depth without public systems of care. And while sort of the normative ideal would be that institutions expand into the community and that kind of they reorganize how they operate, and there are models for that. It's not that this is just an idealism. There are real utopias of this, no? Trieste, to name one. I don't know. Slovenia has also had a bit of this experience with Trate, and but obviously not all is ideal even there, or there are many ways how this can go wrong. But it's a site of struggle. So I think it's as strong as struggles are on it. No, and that's the problem, because struggles usually have their temporal dynamics and cannot be sustained over a long while. So that's also why solidarities between various movements and are important, and also an understanding that civil society does need support to be able to work also in periods when there is no struggle. There is just deep resources of organizing knowledge and potentially dialogue where things can change. And maybe you can't organize massively, but you still need to take care of that body of knowledge and advance it, and then you still need to take care of your collective capacity to act. No, and it's important that you have it, that you can take it elsewhere. From my organizing experience around activism and then politics here in Croatia, I think it's essential that not all battles be losing battles, that you have to try to engage battles that you stand a chance of winning, or at least contesting to a degree that things might change. No, usually the problem with organizing is that it's hugely idealist. It sets itself a high moral ground, but then it necessarily fails because it's impossible to change systems much larger than you are able to mobilize, and systems that have path dependencies lasting decades, and regulations that constrain all sorts of manners of change. And then you set yourself up for failure, and that setting yourself up for failure is one caution I would have against in organizing and activism. Sometimes smaller battles are maybe important.
Thanks so much, Tommy. Yeah, I think we're drawing to a close, but if you will, I just maybe have a last input. You don't even have to, so much respond, as maybe just keeping in mind, maybe in some future opportunity we can discuss it. But I was really excited to hear you thematize like the notion of universal basic services in this context, but I'm also interested in like the broader context of like quote unquote recommodification of housing, energy, food, and so on. And as I mentioned at the beginning, as part of this Ecofuturism venture, part of what I'll be doing is creating these, or co-creating with others, these pre-experiences of, let's say, possible futures that incorporate, say, universal basic services, the care economy, and these other concepts, but kind of in this kind of performance of an everyday life, inviting people to come in and kind of experience it firsthand. And that's a kind of different, let's say, anticipatory politics, as opposed to, say, this interstitial kind of development of social alternatives. And just within this context, I was wondering, and again, you don't have to answer right now, but if you had some ideas for what those experiences could look like, but also perhaps just some critical questions or concerns that co-creators could think with in creating such experiences.
Well, experiences of universal basic services, I think they are easily relatable in many ways. No, it's just that we basic services have to attain through monetary means. No, they are commodified, at least some of them. Healthcare, some places yes, some places not, or some aspects yes, some aspects not. Housing, mostly yes. No, housing in former Yugoslav countries has been privatized, and these days you have to work your ass off or inherit to get there. And usually these basic services are the hardest to achieve. Like what has cheapened, if you look like the expansion of capitalism over the last 50 years, and what prices have gone down, It's the prices of sort of throwaway objects, no, whatever, no, technology has cheapened a lot. I don't know, clothes has cheapened a lot, but housing hasn't. No, it has become more expensive. So I don't have a universal solution, but I'm thinking of the work that, for instance, Tony Brook has done on public provision of food, no, where our common experience today of socialized food provision is a restaurant, no? Whereas you could also think of a milk kitchen or mensa as a form of collective or socialized food provision. So a lot of his work is focusing on that, you know, like how public systems create wealth. And I feel there is a lot there, you know, like these are, and some people say like, we don't want collectivized public provision of food, or we don't want collectivized or public provision of housing. No, these are all contested areas, but I think the experience of what it is not so hard. No, in many ways, I think at least. No, so people usually come with that expectation unless they have enough money or are enough wealth that they care or don't want to care. But also, I guess these basic services or basic goods are a huge element of class differentiation, even in working class. No, there is a beautiful book by let me just look it up. It's called The Asset Economy by Lisa Atkins, Melinda Cooper, and Martijn Konings. It's a small little book about property ownership in Anglo-Saxon countries. So they're Australian, so they're looking at Australia, UK, and the US, but things apply everywhere. The fact whether you have access to property, leaving your family, leaving your parental home at the working age, totally transforms where you will stand at the end of your working life. If you have no property, or I don't know, if your property is in a small place somewhere in rural Croatia, that's worth nothing, and you will have to work your ass off to buy a home. Whereas if you inherit, and a lot of people in our region will inherit because of the privatization of the socialist housing, then you are much well off. Then you kind of have a lot more freedom to choose what work you will do, what are the opportunities that are worthwhile taking, and you will eventually be able to accumulate more money. But that dependence on familial property also reinforces conservatism. That's their point now. Melinda Cooper has written a beautiful book on neoliberalism and conservatism, family values, is the title. So I think these are kind of the problems, you know, that we experience basic services and goods through markets, and even at the sort of working class level, there is a huge differentiation when they are provided privately as opposed to when they are provided publicly. And that's also, again, a position where things come to a head. No, those who inherit maybe are not so keen that there is a wide expansion of public housing and taxation of property, no, and so on and so forth. But yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, could you say again the title of the book that you just mentioned?
The asset economy. I can write it in the chat for you.
The asset economy.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.